Good evening, everybody. I'm Mike Aiken, Chair of the Roman Roads Research Association, and it's about time we made a start with tonight's talk. We're very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Jim Crowe from the University of Edinburgh, who's going to be talking tonight about the forts of Risingham and High Rocherster, the outpost forts of Hadrian's Wall, north of the wall in Northumberland, other forts and camps, the road itself, and of course the link road across the Devil's Causeway. Anyway, without any more spoilers about what he's going to be talking about, Jim, can I ask you to start sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Yep. There we go. Right, if I could just remind everybody that during the talk, if there are any questions you want to ask, just use the chat function. Those will be relayed to me during the course of the talk, and I'll put them to Jim at the end. And with that, I think it's probably best we make a start. So over to you, Jim.
Right. Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks very much for the invitation. I shall talk about work that I've done and which others are doing currently over about 25 years, and reflect also back on what's happened at High Rochester in the past, in particular. What we're looking at, of course, is not High Rochester, but what I always feel is the greatest site in Britain, which is Kew Green. That cumulus of encampments and forts on the flanks of the Cheviots beside Dere Street as it pushes over the hills and north into Scotland. It's one of, I think, the most impressive sites of Roman Britain, and it's comparable to, I think, anywhere in the empire, in that sort of scale of preservation and also the cumulus of antiquities that you see there. I'll be talking about Dere Street, specifically in Northumberland and north of Corbridge, up as far as the Cheviots, and a little bit more. I'll say something about Tabak as well. The road, of course, runs north from Corbridge as far as the Firth of Forth, running towards Cramond, and probably also with a branch road to Inveresk. Both really important forts, and especially the latter, Inveresk, I think is neglected in favour of the wall that lies to the left. It crosses major river catchments, effectively the Tyne and the River Tweed, the River Reed, and then over the Cheviots into Tweeddale, before it climbs north from there as well. It's, I think, important to recognise those different areas. I'm going to start briefly with Risingham Habitancum. There has been some geophysical survey there. The results were not particularly informative. The site is less well known, although I'll show some remains from it a little later. These are the results of a LiDAR survey, which was carried out by the revitalizing Redesdale, and I shall say more and contextualize that. But you can see here a fort beside the River Reed, with later medieval structures over it, but exceptionally well preserved multiple ramparts around the fort. The north side is scooped away by an earlier course of the river. But it's not the remains of the physical earthworks of Risingham I want to start with. It's this great inscription. It's the inscription which is now in the Great North Museum and used to be rather more prominently displayed in the Old Museum of Antiquities. It took up one whole wall, as it must have done in the headquarters building of Habitancum in the Severan period. It's a pageant of Roman conquest. It's 19 feet across. It's of a scale, as far as I'm aware, of this sort of build is certainly unparalleled in Britain. There are fragments, and I shall show you the drawing of the fragments in the next slide, which were put together, but I think epigraphers are fairly happy with the arrangement. Nobody's really challenged it. It records not only provinces and conquests, but also the garrison of Risingham, the cohors 1 Bangiones, the Quitata Miliaria, the Rhiton spearmen, Caesati, the exploratores habitancenses. So a miliary equite cohort, that's about 1,000 strong on paper at least. The Rhiton Gazati, presumably mountain men. Rhytia is on the fringes of the Alps, mountain spearmen. And then the exploratores from Risingham, the exploratores, so from High Rochester. So certainly in the first part of the 3rd century, these were some of the strongest garrisons anywhere in Britain and are very unusual throughout the empire. These are brigade strength garrisons, even not brigade strength, if I say that right, in size. And I think that tells us something about the Roman purpose, certainly at this period. On the left, you see the original description, those are the little bits, and that's how it can be put together. And on the right is a comparable text, but on a much smaller inscription from High Rochester. Just gonna, if I take this down, no, it doesn't make any difference. And just to remind us, it's like as I say, it's like a pageant across the empire. From Arabia in the southeast, Parthia, Adiabini, Sarmatians, Germania, and up to Britain. These are areas of conquest of the Severan families, and as reflected not just on that inscription, but also on the inscription from the South Gate, which we shall see later from Risingham. So that's really just to give you a flavour of what I think the significance was for Rome of these outpost forts north of Hadrian's Wall. I'll be focusing mostly on High Rochester. These views, especially many of the recent views, and especially those taken by a drone, are by Richard Carlton, who is currently directing the excavations and has done since 2021, and he completed his 3rd season this year. You can see very clearly from Richard's view here, the sort of fort platform, of an almost classic example of fort platform. Let me just see if I can get the pointer working. Where's it gone? There. There you can see that's the South Gate. The West Gate is there. A North Gate with some remains, nothing to see of the East Gate. It's occupied by a few sort of 18th century houses. This is an old battle house. There were traces of other buildings in that area behind those trees. There was probably more in medieval and post-medieval times, but we know a reasonable amount about work at post-Roman High Rochester from work by Alan Rushworth. So there we can see the fort platform. On the right, you can see the plan of which was prepared after the excavations in 1852 and 1855, sponsored by the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne and the Duke of Northumberland. And this is the earliest, if one of the earliest, if not the earliest, attempt to produce an internal plan of the fort. And I shall show you the relative accuracy. We tested several of these when we were excavating there in the 90s of this plan a little later. And on the left, I show you the cover of Ian Richmond's chapter in volume 15 of the Northumberland County History, the Romans in Redesdale. And Redesdale benefits from Richmond's work I think, like perhaps no other area, because Richmond was prepared to synthesize not simply previous archaeological works, his own archaeological works, plus all the inscriptions and the sculptures, of which there are very many. And he also included air photographs. Remember, this was published in 1940, air photographs, and he also included Roman Iron Age sites in the vicinity. And I won't be talking about any of those. But I think for its time, it's a remarkable work because it brings so many things together. And it's an example which is rarely followed to the day. We look at one area, we don't look at all other aspects. It's a holistic approach, which is, as I say, quite unusual. And of course, it's a huge benefit if you're working in the region because you can always call back to Richmond's work. The remains from if you want to see the remains from the mid-19th century excavations, you go to the schoolhouse porch, just off the A68, which leads from the main road up towards High Rochester itself. And the schoolhouse itself the porch itself is constructed entirely of spolia, of carved work stones, which were found during the excavations. So there you can see a window head, a pier base, some water channels, and I think for some, the most exciting elements, potentially ballista balls, because we have inscriptions mentioning ballistaria from High Rochester. There are lots of inscriptions. I'll just show you a few of them. They're seen from the 19th century engravings. This one, De Invicto Soli, Invincible Sun, which is always a rare thing in Redesdale, but potentially a Mithraeum. And on the right, Hermogaros, a Greek name, the foster child of a tribune. And I think many know this inscription. It's not the most impressively carved, as you can see here on the right, as it is in Elston Church, but it is extraordinary. The people it mentions are quite exceptional. Rufinus, who was a tribune, who'd previously been subcurata of the Via Flaminia in Italy, and his wife, Julia Lucilla, CF, Clarissima Femina, smart lady of senatorial rank. So either people were pushed out here because they'd been offended their superiors, or maybe it was a place to earn your spurs, to gain glory in a dangerous part of the empire. We know a lot about we know a certain amount about the garrisons, mainly from the epigraphic record. We know there were lingones, cohors equitata at the time of Lollius Urbicus. We have the Vardili, who were Roman citizens, again, cohors equitata miliaria at the time of Caracalla, and the exploratores Bremilienses, which I've already mentioned, as well as the vexellations building works of the 20th and the 6th legions. And I'll come on to talk about the Altus from Jedburgh later on. And then, of course, we have these ladies, which I have to say now in the new museum are rather finely illuminated. And I can only refer you to Richmond's comments in his chapter when he, describing this in some detail, he relates to the Venus's hair. Her hair streams behind her and covers the front of her left shoulder, framing rather than concealing uncouth features divorced from realism. I'll pass over that one. But it's still a remarkable example of provincial sculpture. In terms of the physical remains uncovered in the 19th century, and possibly some of them were apparent beforehand, especially well preserved is the West Gate, shown here, and there the interval tower on the south side. This representation on the right is based on survey that we carried out in the 1990s and overlies the 19th century plan onto a terrain model based on basically total station survey. I'll come on to say a little bit more about that. This was work carried out when I was teaching at Newcastle, and the project lasted from 1992 to 1996, and we returned for a short season in 1998. And we were commissioned by English Heritage and Northumberland National Park to really investigate certain features. It was a joined up project which had lots of geophysical survey, student excavation, and a lot of building recording and so forth. Interestingly enough, this is something I'll refer back to when we look at the results of the geophysical survey. In the area which in the 19th century was marked as unexplored, this corner here, it's quite clear that this part had actually been improved at some time in the early modern period, by which I mean the upper stones had been removed and it was being cultivated, which is, I suspect, why it was not excavated in the mid-19th century. But when we carried out geophysical survey there, we revealed different style of internal buildings to the ones that you see marked in red, which are those from the 19th century excavations. And these, I think, are the pattern of an earlier phase of barrack blocks, let's say the Antonine period barrack blocks. Few traces. The excavation, we tested the interior. There you can see this corner of the headquarters building, and that's a stone pilum here, just below the surface. And this was an excavation behind the Bassel House, which is there, and it's I think the combination of the Victorian plan and the contemporary plan is not quite correct, as we see in the next slide. But there we can see, looking across, that's the same building there that we can see there, looking across, and there you can see how close the Roman levels are to the surface. This was then covered over by an extension to the Bassel House, where the late Beryl Charlton lived. And this is where you can see the traces. This is the Bassel House on the left, and we're talking here, this is the wall. We have the wrong way around, but there's that wall. So the wall we see there is actually this wall here. So that's the roadway, which we can see there, and these are the flags inside the building. So it does allow us some confidence in the 19th century plan, and you'll notice the internal bathhouse, not an external bathhouse, as we find elsewhere normally, you say, on most of the wall forms. So I'll obviously be coming back to some of the work that Newcastle University did in the 90s, but I'd like to flag the achievements of a much more recent project, which was revitalizing Redesdale and Roman Redesdale, and a series of LiDAR studies all the way up the valley, but not, unfortunately, not as far as Kew Green, but lots elsewhere. And this was carried out by Paul Frodgson, Karen Collins, and Chris Jones of the National Park. And the results, which you can access with that address, which I've given at the top there, are really quite remarkable and deserve, I think, a greater awareness. And here you can see I've simply overlaid our plan of the fort to the LiDAR version of the fort. And of course, this is the same LiDAR where the Risingham Hadrian image came from a little earlier. So there's the fort, and we'll see that more. Now, let's think about this area thinking about these LiDAR surveys. Let's think about this, the remains, particularly in the 1st century. This is David Breeze's map, and it shows Newstead, Elginhuff, Newstead and High Rochester. What it doesn't show is marked there, which is Blakehoe. And I show that simply because Blakehoe comes up really well in the LiDAR surveys. There's some really interesting results. This also shows the road pattern of Dere Street, and as was mentioned earlier in the introduction, the Devil's Causeway running up towards Berwick, but actually no further than Tweedmouth. And more importantly, the crossroad which links across through the valley of the Coquet and then across towards the Allen and up there to Low Learchild, which your group have produced a really interesting report, which we talked about in Berwick last summer. Now, Blakehope then. So Blakehope lies to the south of High Rochester. At this period, there's no evidence that Risingham was occupied. Blakehope is about there on this plan. There. Okay. This is the LiDAR image of Blakehope. A plan of Blakehope is produced by Richmond in the Northumberland County History, and he shows the outline of the fort and a small annex on the south side. But what was not recognized previously was the rig and furrow there, but more importantly, the remains of earthworks. And so, you know, it comes out really well. These earthworks show up beautifully in the LiDAR. So some quite, you know, some lots and lots of remains of Roman Iron Age sites, other period prehistoric sites, all apparent from this community project, which was Heritage Lottery funded, which the National Park had organised. So let's turn now to High Rochester. We've seen this, we've seen the fort, and also, of course, we can see High Rochester itself is surrounded by a series of Roman marching camps. Some across, this is the line of the Silsburn. The reed is down here on the left. And so you've got marching camps there, and you've got a much bigger marching camp. So one marching camp, and then presumably a later marching camp on the other side there. No marching camps are known on the east side of the burn. There are other marching camps along the line, the road, as it progresses, and there are a number of marching camps all the way up Dere Street. So there's the two phases of the Burdock camps that we can see outlined here. Now, what does the LiDAR reveal about the fort itself? The fort in its setting, there's some very strong later features of rig and furrow, but also you can see that just like, well, not quite just like, but similar to Risingham, we have very powerful earth banks. In fact, Richmond excavated up here, and there are a sequence of 4 banks and ditches in that direction. We excavated out here, and I think you can see 1, 2. We think we got 3. I think there's only 2 in this direction over there. The LiDAR also shows the line of the Roman road running towards the south, and also the line of that Roman road I showed you on the map, which is running across into Coquetdale over towards Holystone. And it also shows very clearly this very prominent spur on the west side of the fort. And much of what I'll be talking about and be showing towards the end is actually situated in that area. Interestingly enough, you see in the middle, the LiDAR actually recognizes those features which we were able to identify through excavation, but also correspond with the 19th century plan. This is the result of, this is a representation of the surveys which were carried out between 1992 to 1996 by GeoQuest. It's labeled Bremenian 2003 because that's a later iteration of it, but this is essentially what GeoQuest carried out in the early 90s. Rochester has benefited from 3 major campaigns of geophysics. First of all, in the 1990s, again in 2003, and then finally, as a result of the very most recent project, which Carlton has been directing. And interestingly enough, they complement one another very nicely. There are not many. There are no new sudden images have appeared. We've extended the areas that have been investigated, but it's quite clear that the geophysics at the very end of the 20th century is pretty much as good as the geophysics in the first quarter of the 21st. So it's reassuring when we look at the results. This is, we were able to carry out an extensive resistivity survey. Of course, that's not always the case because resistivity can be quite expensive, it's time consuming. And what they were able to show very clearly was the line of the Roman road heading off towards Holystone and Low Learchild, and the line of the Roman road running south towards Corbridge. And other features, but noticeably see this annex wall there, and then other features which will be shown in the magnetometer. The road running towards the south, towards Corbridge, as you can see here, rises up onto the high ground of Petty Knowes, which looks down to the fort, which is the known site of a cremation cemetery that was excavated by Harold Charlton, and also a series of rather remarkable stone tombs. More were known in the 19th century before one of them was robbed away. And the traces, we were able in the 1990s to investigate traces of the road, and there you can see a very clear curb of the road as this is up on this high ground up here. There's the nice curb and some students working on the road surface there. So that's, and then the link road, which we've already mentioned, running off towards Low Learchild in that direction there. Now, the parts of that road were investigated near Holystone by Richard Carlton, and here you can see, and I'm sure many of you will have seen this before, a remarkable preserved section of Roman road with a wonderful spina at its middle. Richard says, a reflection of the fact it's so well preserved may indicate that it was rarely ever used. I don't know whether that's correct or not, but it's still an astonishing road. However, I have actually seen really well preserved Roman roads in Turkey, for instance, which look just as good as that, and that's without any soil on them or any excavation. So Roman roads can survive despite constant use over long periods of time. This is just to remind you of the pattern of Roman known marching camps on the line of the Devil's Causeway going up towards Tweedmouth, and also you'll notice the marching camps on the south banks of the Tweed running up towards Kelso and as far as Newstead. Significantly, they're all on the south side of the Tweed, not on the north side, which again encourages one to think that the Roman road here didn't actually extend over towards Berwick. We're safe from the Romans, where I'm speaking from now. So, having looked at some of the road across to Low Learchild, let's return to the geophysical survey from the 1990s, and this is the geomagnetic survey. And you'll see that the road doesn't show up, especially hardly at all. But what does show up is a large enclosure here, distinct from the enclosure that emerged from the resistivity survey. And you'll also see here is the pattern of barracks, which I talked about in this northwestern corner. There are also other features which I'll come on to, hotspots and so forth, but we'll see in more detail a little later. I just motion, you can see this line there is the aqueduct channel, I think the line of the aqueduct, which was picked up in the 19th century excavations. And it was possible some of those stones in the schoolhouse porch actually derived from this aqueduct. But there's the aqueduct. This is coming down from Petty Knowes. Petty Knowes is, as I say, much higher than the fort itself and looks down onto the fort. This is just views of the excavations on the, actually go back to the previous slide. We were interested really to look at, to see what these traces were here, because one of the objectives of the project in the 1990s was trying to investigate how far there was the potential for extramural settlements outside an outpost fort. It was at a time when we were certainly everyone was aware of Vici, places like Housesteads and Vindelander, and the work of Alan Biggins and others, and more recent excavations, whether it's at South Shields or whether it's currently at Bird Oswald, has amplified our understanding of extramural settlements on Hadrian's Wall. And the question was, would this be the case in the outpost zone? And there were these features here on the road, which we then investigated, but they really didn't come up with very much. It was a sort of a stony spread rather than a significant structural features, as for instance are known, for example, from the air photographs of Old Carlisle in Cumbria, where you actually find a road and a settlement associated with the road outside of the fort. It may be, as Richard has shown on the western side, that a deeper excavation might reveal more, but certainly the geophysics and limited excavations by students didn't actually reveal anything very significant in terms of a settlement outside of the fort on the eastern side, beside the line of the Roman road. I mean, that's what we were sort of thinking about, but it certainly didn't show up. And this is a quite recent reconstruction by English Heritage of the vicus, although the vicus itself looked very uniform. It looks much more like a sort of holiday park rather than a proper civil settlement. Let's return to High Rochester. So the resistivity had shown this annex, and we thought we would try and investigate it because it seemed to correspond quite closely with the area where Ian Richmond had excavated in 1935. And you can see actually why we've got this slide up. You can see here on the west side there are some features beside the road, but nothing as clear as we can see over on this side. And I'll show a more detailed image of that a little later. So we have granaries, we have an internal bathhouse within the fort. The fort itself is actually very compact. It's very crowded, but that's to be expected given the potential size of the garrison, which I've already mentioned. I'm turning this round. North is now to the north, so you have to sort of remember that we're up till now north has been at the top of the screen, but now it's turned around, so we can look towards the west, and it's that annex which I was pointing out in the slide. So this is the GeoQuest image from 1992, which shows this annex wall, and that's the features which we were able to survey. This is our survey of the remains, and this in turn is the geomagnetic view, which shows just about see that. It's difficult to trace, but there's lots of elements from here, and you'll notice also these hotspots, and I'll come back to these hotspots. Now, at the time, I wasn't convinced that this feature was actually a Roman feature, and did suggest it might actually be a pre-Roman Iron Age feature. I don't believe that anymore, as the excavations would have shown. But at the same time, you can see the difference between the form of represented from the resistivity compared to that from the geomagnetometer. And there we can see, and you notice the hotspot there and the hotspot there. And this is the area of Ian Richmond's trench down here. And this is the photograph he publishes in Northumberland County History of that trench. And this is his not terribly clear plan showing the phasing. But if we go back to the photograph, there's clearly a ditch, and there's a line of stones there, and he seems to have piled most of his spoil on top of it, so he couldn't expand it any further. I mean, the one criticism, which I think is understandable, is that Richmond, probably because he had very limited resources, both in time and in terms of manpower, was content to excavate quite narrow trenches, whereas today, of course, we excavate much larger areas. Anyway, back to the Richmond's interpretation of this. Here we can see the ditch, and then we can see this, what he calls the later Flavian foundation. That then goes, what he doesn't mark is that will be, I think, the line of the wall that goes with this ditch. In other words, it's the base of the turf rampart of the fort. And then C, on top of that, is the Antonine fort wall. Again, I'm not convinced. I think this may all actually belong to the let's call it the Flavian. We'll call it Flavian. In other words, the sort of later 1st century turf and timber fort. And then latterly you get the Antonine fort. And remember, there's actually no real convincing evidence for a Hadrianic phase for the outpost forts in the east, although, of course, it certainly is the case for Bewcastle, Netherby, and the forts in the west and Berenice. So we have outpost forts in the west, but not outpost forts on the line of Dere Street. And maybe this is something we come back to. And then there's quite clearly there's a major stone phase. So that's the sort of, I would suggest actually that's the Antonine phase, but he calls that the Severan, because he wants to have a Constantinian or Constantian phase. Obviously, I've spelled it wrong. It's Constantian, and I explain why that's important later on. So that's the Constantian phase there. Okay. So what this view shows, so that's the bit of wall, that's the outline, it's our initial trench. That's when we picked up Richmond's trench and emptied it. And what you can see has happened is that it's much clearer here than from Richmond's view, is that the weight of the wall, of the later walls, has pushed down. And we're here dealing with something which is not primary, but was a secondary feature. So initially there's the Flavian fort, turf and timber fort with a ditch up to the fort, and that's then been filled in. And this footing, which would then have had turf on it, because this is the remains of turf. So this is a turf rampart. And that corresponds with that feature which we saw from the resistivity. So that's the feature there. So in other words, that was that point there, and that's running up like that, up to there, and then down. And we picked it up again here, and this is the turf rampart in this area here. Well, that's how we left it, more or less, in when we ceased work there in 1996. So I was delighted when Richard Dalton told me that as part of money, as sort of money within the revitalizing resale project, there was the potential for at least one season of excavation in the area to the west of the fort, and this is Richard's view of that. There we have the west gate, and there we have the remains. This is, of course, the field wall, but these are the remains of the fort wall, which you can see on this side. And initially, they opened in this area here, one of which was associated with the hotspot, and it was also it more or less fitted in with where we had suggested there were a series of those enclosures or annexes in this western field, Gallows Now. And then there was to be another excavation over there, the hotspot located over there, which we will come back to. Excuse me. So the interior, the annex, and then there's the first annex, and there's what I think, as we shall see, is the second annex, one hotspot there and another hotspot there. So the first two excavations are this area here and this area there. And then I shall come on to describe that area there. So that's one trench, that's another trench there. So first of all, that more northerly trench, Trench A, this is looking, north is at the very top. You can see there. So we're looking northwards. There's the line of stone footings for a turf rampart. And these are the remains of the turf rampart. And I shall show you that. So cutting through it there, which I should be able to demonstrate that it is really a turf rampart. This is a 19th century field drain, just confuse matters. And this, very interestingly, is a gateway in the rampart. And it's a gateway in the rampart, which is constructed it's got stone cheeks, if you like. It's got side walls in stone, which then butt up against the turf wall, which may suggest perhaps that it's cut into the pre-existing turf rampart. This reddened area here may represent the hotspot in this area. It wasn't entirely clear. But certainly the configuration of this is really very interesting. I understand there was an example, something similar to this from Vindolanda, but otherwise it's quite unusual that you should have a stone gateway in a turf rampart. And now for the real cognoscenti of turf. Here you can see the individual turf lines in that cutting which I showed you earlier on. And this is being studied by my colleague at Edinburgh, Dr. Ben Russell, or Professor Ben Russell now, who at that time had a Leverhulme project which was looking specifically at turf and mud brick as a building material in the Roman world. And so this was one of the areas that they sampled and are continuing to study. So there's the turfs of that rampart which went up to that stone base. What was interesting was that Richard Carlton was able to demonstrate through the careful use of a mechanical digger that there were not just the turf rampart and the front as we saw it, but a sequence of really quite substantial ditches. So we have ditches all the way around the fort, and then we have ditches around the annex. And of course, when you have ditches, you find things like bits of a shoe, as you see there. And there were finds from the excavations both in 2021 and in 2022, and this is a coin of Hadrian on the left and a coin of Trajan on the right. Later coins, some pottery, some interesting, really rather interesting blue grass, which Lindsay Jones can comment on, and also this evidence here, which really looks as though we're dealing with craft and industrial workshops. And all of the excavations within this area, everything points to it being used, or certainly parts of it being used, both inside the ramparts and also outside the ramparts for industrial activity. In other words, it was not an area of residence. It was partially residence, but it was an area of manufacturing and fabrication and repair. If we go to the second trench in this area, in the first season, it really didn't look terribly promising. There was this extensive sort of flagged area on one side of the trench, and there was this rather sort of dreary looking small stone area with what was something behind it. However, further excavation of this revealed that underneath this stony spread was in fact a line of stones, and that's where it stopped in 2021. 2022, it's all very easy when you're talking like this, and you can just, and then was revealed the following, was one of the most remarkable, I suppose I shouldn't get too carried away, but I was extremely surprised to see this. It's essentially a really well constructed stone facing with a rubble back, which is in front of a turf rampart, which is the remains of the turf rampart there. So this was the first annex, if you like, the smaller annex, which would probably, in its first instance, which was of turf, and then later on, and this is not uncommon. This is a phenomenon of the transformation from turf and timber towards stone fortifications in Roman camps and forts. But here you can see it very clearly. And I'm not yet sure how good the dating evidence is for this, and I'll wait for Richard's more detailed reports. But it's still a quite surprising and I think remarkable discovery. So we have a stone gateway through another phase of annex, and then this annex has a stone facing wall. So the first ones I showed you were there with the hotspot, and then the second one that's located there in this annex, like that. Now let's turn to the third hotspot, the third area of excavation, hotspot 1. Hotspot 1 excavated. The results were quite simply extraordinary to my mind, because cut into, this is the, if I go back one slide, the next slide will show you this bank coming really clearly. It shows you much more clearly. This is the power of the drone over LiDAR and all sorts of things, but this is the bank coming through here. And you can see how this has been inserted into that bank. So this is the bank coming through, that one stopped, and this is what they found. On the right, there we are digging away, and Richard's colleagues who dug it were really stalwart. And what they had found was, for the first time anywhere in the north of Britain, a lime kiln, a complete lime kiln. The last time one was discovered was by F.G. Simpson at Howstead in 1909. And since I have a certain interest in lime mortar and its similar works, I was quite thrilled to see this emerging, and quite thrilled to see the final results, which they, this is Richard's photograph, of Richard Carlton's photograph of the cleaned out interior of this lime kiln. And of course, a lime kiln of this type, on this scale, cut into a pre-existing rampart, tells us a great deal about what's happening to the fort, because it's a very major reconstruction project which we're witnessing. And I'll return to that. And then, just to conclude from the excavations, because it's there's a lot more that can be said. There were excavations further down the hill, and you'll see it in the next slide where they are. This was located in 2021, and then so there's the Bassel House. That's the area of the lime kiln. The other excavations are over here, and then this area here, which was excavated just over a week early in last September, down here. And I will mention also this field wall, so just to locate where the field wall is being restored. And this is the results which Richard showed me from a drone image. Most recently, this is from last September, and you can see there are well-built stone structures, but lots of burning and other material, all relating to various sorts of activity in this part of the fort. And these are some of the stones which were, there's Richard himself on the left with his stone waller, and these are the stones which have been identified and taken out of the wall. And there are lots and lots of different drafted stones, no new inscriptions as yet, but all sorts of really interesting, what are referred to often as the interesting stones, but interesting stones in terms of working and so forth, which have emerged from that site. Okay, I'll come back to the chronologies and what that means a little while, but I'd just like to now just check my time. Yeah, time's fine. Okay. Think about High Rochester in its context. Think about what's happening, and also think about the line of Dere Street. And in the first century, Dere Street is simply a road, and the forts along it are road forts. In the Antonine period, when the Romans reoccupy the Fourth Clyde Isthmus and the construction of the Antonine Wall, once again, it emerges as simply road forts on the main communications and supply routes running up to the more northerly frontier. Once, however, the Antonine Wall is abandoned, and conventionally this seems to be, it's now thought to be not 180s as it used to be, but sort of more likely to be late in the 160s. The abandonment of the Antonine Wall, then these forts, High Rochester and Risingham, and also Cappock and up until 180 Newstead, are in fact outpost forts. Outpost forts quite a long way north of Hadrian's Wall. And we've already seen in the first slide the aerial view of Kew Green, and amongst the marching camps and other temporary works, there is clear evidence for a fortlet, not insignificant fortlet, with a very large, long annex. Matt Simmons has discussed this in the context of the another annex in Oxton, which is further north along the line of Dere Street, north of Lauder, getting up towards Midlothian. But of course, more importantly, in terms of High Rochester, on the other side of the Cheviots, and before one gets to Newstead itself, as you can see from this map, is the fort at, or fortlet at Cappock, because it doesn't actually, it's not, it's one of these places, it's not quite small enough to be a proper fortlet, but at the same time, it's not quite large enough to be considered to be a fort. I don't know where you would, well, the middle term is. This is the plan that Richmond published in Society of Analysis of Scotland, based on from his excavations in 1949 and earlier excavations in the 20th century. There are some stone buildings and these buildings here, and Richmond recognized 4 basic phases, but it's worth remembering that at that time it was accepted that the Antonine Wall had 2 phases, and now I think most people would accept that it has essentially only one main phase, although there are some sort of outstanding questions in various places, and one wonders if some places might have remained in control and others not. But I'm no expert on the Antonine Wall, so please don't ask me too much about that. All one knows about is that here we have four phases that's recognized. And it would be quite, I think it might, rather than seeing 2 phases in the Flavian period and 2 in the Antonine, as Richmond suggests, I think it might be more straightforward to say 1 Antonine phase and then possibly then a Severan phase, given that there are these inscriptions, which I mentioned earlier from Jedburgh. Well, there's 2 inscriptions from Jedburgh from an altar, which mention the Valduli from Habitancum from Risingham, and also another one mentioned the Rhaetian Gesartorum, these Rhaetian spearmen. And there's also from Cappock itself, there is the fragment of the building inscription of Legge 20, although the form of that suggests that's probably Antonine rather than later. Well, that's what's written in RIB. But the 2 altars from Jedburgh, some have suggested there was a Roman station at Jedburgh, but it's a bit off the line of the road, and there's no other evidence for it. One suspects, as is often the case, I mean, I still don't think there's a Roman fort at Hexham, and yet there's an awful lot of Roman reused material in Hexham and so forth. So I think it's simply the interest of the abbey. It's only 4 miles from Cappock to Jedburgh after all, so it's no great distance to move them around. So I suspect they probably come from Cappock, and others have said exactly the same, although some people still suggest it may be some form of installation at Jedburgh. But the importance is that it gives us some idea of the reach of Rome. In other words, the intention of not simply maintaining garrisons on the line of the road, but using those places as jumping off points to ensure there are long distance patrols and long distance activities. And as I mentioned at the beginning, both High Rochester and Risingham together, if they were at reasonable strengths, are well into a brigade by anybody's standards. So, and also it's also worth recalling that the sort of forces that could be normally mustered by tribal groups would have been relatively small. I think it's pretty rare that you have very large forces which are able to cause the Romans any problem. Maybe those in 180 when we hear about the crossing of the wall, maybe those were larger, but it's unclear. So Cappock, I think, needs to be considered in any discussion of on the north side of the Cheviots, and also the unexcavated fortlet at Chew Green. Now, in terms of the building works and the lime kiln that we see at High Rochester, I think we do have to be reminded of the what's known from Risingham. The inscription I've already mentioned on the top left, and that comes from the South Gate in the same way that the inscription that I described from the headquarters building comes from is known, fragments are known from excavations in the headquarters building. This is known from the South Gate. And of course, the South Gate is the most extraordinary gate in north of York. It is the only example of a gateway with projecting towers, whereas the rest of the Roman world was merrily innovating in terms of fortifications by making its towers project. So you had potential flanking fire and all the rest of it. The conservative garrisons on Hadrian's Wall maintained the patterns which had been established essentially under Hadrian, and didn't change, except they did change on the outpost forts. They changed here, and actually, if you look at the plan of the gateway of the West Gate, it's not a conventional gate by sort of Hadrian's Wall standards either. It's also interesting who was going to look at these huge inscriptions, and this is a fantastic inscription, the one from Risingham, and I wonder whether by the 3rd century the chieftains, the Roman Iron Age chieftains of the tribes north of the wall, many of them would have had a knowledge of Latin, and some of them could potentially even read. After all, we have evidence for well, there's one particular set of graffiti from the north, but from Traprain. But at the same time, I think the audience is not necessarily and entirely a local, a Roman audience. I think it might also be a sort of external, sort of the Free Britons north of the wall. So the really rather remarkable stonework and the remarkable pattern of the Severian Gate dated by this inscription here, and then the later blocking, which we can see, which post-Constantian. Although, of course, Richmond actually suggests, yes, the gate is essentially, the restoration is Constantian. Now, Constantian, that brings us to, just before I talk about the abandonment of the fort, what do we think is, I've made a lot of mention about what's happening in the Severan period, or rather in the period at the time of Severus' advances into Scotland, but also at the time after the withdrawal and the time of Caracalla and inscription going on at the time of Elagabalus up into the 230s. Now this is the two drawings are from Tyne Weir's archives, and I'm very grateful to Paul Bidwell for showing me these some years ago. The one on the left represents the wall very close to the excavation of where we excavated and where Richmond had excavated up on the northwest corner. It's in this area here. But you can see quite clearly that it's a very large block stonework. It's very different. This large block stonework you can see here, that is, and you can see how the wall has bulged, and you can actually see that. It's not very easy to recognize. It's normally very overgrown. But at that stage, this is a while ago, we managed to clear the whole thing, and you can see it very clearly. And so that little spur there represents that bit of wall there. And again, this is quite clearly a rebuild. Now, the gate, the West Gate in the phase that you can see it now, I would be very confident to say that this belongs to all this building work, which is specifically directed towards the restoration of the balustari in the Severan period, but also the gate. I think and Richmond thought the same, and he gave parallels to the mouldings and so forth. And I don't think there's any reason to question that. And so our lime kiln, which is situated sort of down there, would have been for the complete reconstruction of this whole section of wall and much of the south wall. And we don't know anything about the walls on this side. But it's that level of reconstruction, really well-built reconstruction, although surprisingly it needed to be sort of patched up in this area here. Now, what's important about the drawing is that if you were to go to the west gate today, you will see that there is a closing wall. But the closing wall, if you look at it, you can't really tell whether it's a 19th century closing wall or whether it's actually originally Roman. And I had no clear idea until I saw this mid-19th century drawing from Collingwood Bruce collection, in which case clearly the gate had been blocked. So that's really important, because if that gate was blocked, that tells us quite a lot about what's going on out here in those areas of annexes. That's those two big annexes which are extending out here. Now, from what we know so far, nothing in terms of ceramics that's been found out there dates any later than towards the end of the 3rd century. So I hope you can see where I'm going. If that is blocked, it's probably going to be blocked sort of after sort of 280, 290, if most of the latest ceramics out here, probably from that date, because you can't access that area anymore. And that then brings us into the campaigns of Constantius Chlorus and his son Constantine, which are described in the panegyrics and campaigns against the Picti. And I was very pleased to see in John Reed's recent book on Roman Scotland that I think he gives due space. Normally Roman Scotland, after the withdrawal, the Antonine War, and then there's that rather unfortunate campaigns by Severus, where the Romans are very unsuccessful and the emperor dies and it's all a disaster. And then Romanists seem to lose, I mean, certainly some Romanists seem to lose interest at that point, which I think is a great mistake. Being a late Romanist, I would say that. But at the same time, Constantius, and I mean, the panegyrics are very clear. They're fighting against the Picts. They're campaigning against the Picts, and the Picts, I think most would accept, are north of the Firth of Forth. So these are campaigns which will have been conducted along the line of Dere Street. Now, the other piece of evidence for when the fort was abandoned, of course, coins. But the only coins that were available were coins that were discovered in the course of the excavations in the mid-19th century, the excavations of 1852 and 1855. And those were studied by John Casey. And John Casey observed that the coins sort of finished at the time of Constantine, and there's nothing later. And so he suggested, therefore, that the garrison had been withdrawn after that. The absence of evidence is always difficult to deal with, but personally, I think there's sufficient in terms of the structural evidence to suggest that there certainly was a presence, even if that presence wasn't at the same scale as had existed up to the end of the 3rd century. And from there, I can't say any more. I think any later would be a speculation, but as I say, I think these are pretty sort of major works of repair, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. So that suggests that the Romans were maintaining the fort, despite what some of the numismatic evidence would suggest. And as for the lime kiln, well, as I've already mentioned, the lime kiln goes with the restoration of the Balistari and the construction of that wonderful west gate. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll leave you with the cheerful figure of Cocidius, which looks down on the branch road linking High Rochester to Low Learchild from South Yardhope. I went to look for it. I couldn't find it. I hope to see it one day. So I picked somebody else's image for that. And I'd like to thank all those people on the screen, especially Beryl Chanson, who's no longer with us, but Richard and all the others, and Paul Frodson, and all the people in the past who've worked with me at High Rochester. And I'm just pleased to be able to work with others in the future. So thank you for listening. And this quotation from Rudyard Kipling is from Puck of Hope's Hill, when he talks about that big purple heather country of broken stone north of the wall. And for those who enjoy Redesdale I think that's a good way to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. An excellent talk, absolutely fascinating. And as predicted, we had a good audience tonight, around about 200. So
Right.
I'm anticipating quite a lot of questions. We've got
All
some
right.
in already, so we'll probably better get on with them. I'm going to ask you one first of all, which is actually from someone who's not here, from Dave Armstrong, our secretary, who couldn't make it tonight. He asked me to put this one to you. If I don't do it now, I'll forget. It's about essentially about Blakehope, and he was wondering what your thoughts were on its possible purpose. It doesn't fit in with the chain of other forts. It's really on its own. That it's about what 15 miles from Corbridge, and he was just wondering what you thought. Was that an outpost fort on its own at a time when the others were possibly not occupied, or is some other function?
It's interesting that it's actually at a bridge, at a river crossing, which neither Risingham, I don't know that well, but it's not really at a river crossing. Whereas Blakehope is at a river crossing. And actually, Richmond makes the point that Cappock is at a river, close to a river crossing as well. I don't know the site of Cappock, and it's not particularly obvious. But I mean, it's obviously, it belongs to the well, one would guess the Flavian period. And yet there is something at High Rochester, but maybe that's because there is the link road to Low Learchild. But then that, I mean, you can easily create a nice circular argument there. So I'll stop speculating, and go back to Blakehope. As I think in that early phase it may well have been put there, perhaps before even Risingham or High Rochester, simply because it was a river crossing, and that was needed to be monitored. But remember, we're at a stage of road forts rather than outpost forts.
Yes.
So it has a different sort of role, and I think Matt Simmons' point about the fortlets with their large annexes for traffic is, you have to remember that these forts, on the one, I've been stressing the sort of military aspects of High Rochester and the balustari and so forth. It's difficult to escape from that on that hand. And yet at the same time, they would have been, for much of their lives, when they're road forts, they're just maintaining secure and transport along the line of the roads. But Blakehope is interesting, and when Charles Daniels died, Lindsay Allison-Jones handed me a small file and said, "Oh, you'd be interested in this." And it was the results of Charles' excavations at Blakehope, which was a small trench, and sadly, it didn't actually tell us a huge amount.
Has it ever been geophysed?
No, I don't think so.
There's maybe something we
yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting, and the very fact it's got that, there's another aspect to it, the fact that it's sitting within a marching camp.
Very neat.
And I didn't have the opportunity to go back and look at, I mean, obviously Richmond didn't get that, but I didn't go back to have a look at the Royal Commission book on the marching camps in England to be able to check that. But the fact that it's sitting within a marching camp is interesting, because obviously there's a marching camp first and then there's a fort afterwards. You don't put a fort. Well, you could put a fort in a marching camp.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's in the book. Anyway, but I won't. Just behind me. We'll move on to the questions from the floor tonight. I'll go through them in order. From Damien, were the water pipes in the internal bathhouse at Bromenium made of clay or lead?
I don't know. I don't think there's any. I would have to go, but I have looked at the Archaeologia Aliana report, but I can't remember. It was a long time ago, and I can't remember the details like that. I'm sorry. I mean, it's I would guess if they were found, they would probably be lead, but I simply don't know.
Okay.
I mean, the other question is whether that's a primary bathhouse. It could be. I would expect it to be, because it Bewcastle has an internal bathhouse as well.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's quite small. That's all.
Moving on, completely different now. What happened to GeoQuest? That's from Terry Edwards, who apparently tried to track them down but met a dead end.
No idea.
No, I'm afraid I don't either. And the one person I know,
I had a slightly unsatisfactory relationship with them, so I don't want to say any more.
Okay, fair enough. From Albert, our treasurer, do you have any width measurements of the two roads? Specifically, he's meaning between the ditches. He's asking this, I think, sort of on my behalf, because he knows this is a pet project of mine. Ditch separations.
I would need we have records, but for a variety of reasons we weren't really able to bring together the material that we looked at in the 1990s, and I would hope over the next year, amongst other things, to try and sort some of those out. But there will be, I think there might well be records, but I don't know. Okay. I don't know. I can't say offhand.
I'd be certainly interested to find out. Just for the audience who won't be aware of this, there's a growing body of evidence now to suggest that the majority of roads in this country have a ditch separation of around about 18 meters. So it's roughly 60 Roman feet, so half an actus.
Yes.
Except in very hilly country when they tend to be by the side of the road. So as this is in reasonably hilly country, I suspect that's why I was asking. Again from Terry Edwards, about stony spreads. I'm not sure what the question is here. This is about the possible vicus, I think. It's more of a comment rather than a question. So not everything was built to the same standard. So could stony spreads be more significant?
They might be, and it may be that the way that we excavated those and the limited excavation of those might have revealed more. I was able to see some of the excavations at Bird Oswald this summer, and to be fair, what we found at High Rochester didn't really reflect what they were. And the extramural buildings at Bird Oswald were not particularly well preserved, but they were a lot more. It was a lot clearer what was there. And then when you see what Richard Carlton has found on the west side of the fort, there are real walls, the walls I showed you. There are proper walls of structures, even if they can't make out what they are. So if you find those on the west side, why don't you get them on the east? And because they certainly didn't turn up on the east.
Potentially two different periods, perhaps?
I think that's unlikely. No, we did look quite hard, and we kept on finding areas of slag and material like that, as if there was a lot of working areas. I think you have to think about armies on the move and the amount of repairs that they have to do. And I think High Rochester, in some senses, was a sort of a service area rather than. And obviously there are children, and there are some inscriptions of women, as a guy showed. So both of those, although one was commanding officer's wife, but at the same time, I would be, and there's something in the epigraphic evidence that says that people other than soldiers there. But I still am not convinced there's anything specifically of a civil character like a vicus.
And I've noticed Terry, the questioner, has just come back and suggested zoning.
Well, yes, I think there is a zoning insofar that the annexes on the west are clearly protected and seem to be more intensively occupied, and the more excavations that are carried out reveal a really complex set of structures. Whereas, as I say, from the excavations that we carried out on the east side, and the geophysics didn't sort of imply that.
Okay. Yep, questions are still coming. From Rob. another one of our staff tonight. I promise you not all the questions are coming from ourselves. Did he say that the road to Learchild from High Rochester seemed to have little use?
That was Richard Carlton's comment on when he excavated or re-excavated that section with the Holystone group. They revealed a really well preserved road, as I showed you in that image, and I think you can get a copy of the report from Richard if you haven't got it. Excuse me. But my view was, and he said, "Oh well, this is perhaps because the road wasn't all that used very frequently." Well, that's possible. But then my comment, which I mentioned, was that I've seen Roman roads in Turkey where you can actually see a proper Roman road still on the ground.
Yeah,
and they've been used not by vehicular traffic, but by animals and people, and they haven't suffered a great deal.
Rob goes on to say, do you interpret that as access to Learchild being largely replaced by the Devil's Causeway?
I don't think you can say that.
No. I actually have a slight issue with the interpretation of the road not being particularly well used. The problem is the raised spine down the centre. We've got plenty of examples of spines in road construction. That one is unusual in that it's upstanding from the stone layer. Now the others are built within the foundation layer of stone.
Right.
This one isn't.
Right.
I do wonder if what we're possibly seeing there is a very large degree of erosion. If the surface layer was
right, I'm with you.
fine material, it could have gone a long time ago. So we're not actually seeing the road surface at all. What we're actually seeing is the foundation layer,
is a foundation
with a raised spine, which may have been intended as a marker for the top of the agger, telling the construction team that's where you've got to put the center of the agger and then camber down to the edges.
It's quite a well, I mean, having excavated bits of the military way behind Hadrian's Wall, it's a pretty well foundationed road.
It is, yes. Yeah. I didn't actually see the excavation while it was open, unfortunately. I've only seen the photographs, but it certainly is. Just moving on. From Rick, I'm assuming this is about High Rochester. Is there any visible evidence of the aqueduct serving the fort water supply?
No. It was traced in. It was mentioned in the accounts of the mid-19th century excavations, and I don't know. I think those channels actually in the porch of the schoolhouse actually are just water channels. They're not necessarily found. I think they're too shallow to be aqueduct channels.
Okay.
But no, there's no trace. But it was precisely, well, it wasn't precisely, but it was very much in the area leading down from Petty Naus, where one would expect an aqueduct leading to the south gate to be.
Okay. From Meg Hardy, could you say a bit more about the Romans' use of lime kilns?
I think that's another talk.
It so amazes me that we actually have so few of them, as you've made clear. Particularly if they were for specific local use, as at High Rochester.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're right. I mean, there are a number of there are batteries of lime kilns known from the Roman Rhineland. There are lime kilns known in some instances. Where you actually see lime kilns most is, I mean, this is outside of Britain, is in late antique towns in sort of Turkey, where you find that they're taking all the nice marble statuary and then they need to build something, and they create a lime kiln in the town and they use it to burn the marble statuary to make good quality lime mortar. But it is very surprising. I think I know. I think I've seen the potential for a lime kiln north of Hadrian's Wall in the central sector, which I published in one of the Limes congresses a long time ago. But by and large, you're quite right. There's very few known. And for instance, in the sections of Hadrian's Wall which I excavated, where there's really fantastically well-preserved Roman lime mortar. We have no specific evidence for where the lime was burnt and prepared.
Okay.
Which is why I was so excited by the one.
Yeah, well, it's quite spectacular, really, isn't it? It really is. But there must be plenty of them. I suppose one of the reasons is so we still have relatively few decent geophysical surveys done on so many forts. There's so many that have just never been touched.
Yes.
And quite possibly we might see them as
perhaps if we know that a hotspot.
We would.
I think Richard with the hotspots was really after a pottery kiln because he likes pottery. You see,
looked a bit small for that for me, but anyway.
Oh yes, it was.
Yeah. Another one from Terry Edwards. It's an observation. I think most Roman industrial processes were quite smelly, smoky. So have I missed the point? I'm not sure what the question is there.
Well, they were, and I don't think the Romans cared about it, actually. Well, I think they might have cared about it. There in the I think it's in the 5th century rather than the 4th century in Constantinople. There's a complaint in the Theodosian law code saying, do not put your lime kilns too close to the imperial palace.
Maybe that's Terry's point. That's possibly Terry's point. Perhaps the reason we're not seeing them is some of them are a considerable distance away from the fort. That could be it.
Well, no, well, they might be. No, I think then, but it's not at Housesteads. It's just down the slope from the fort.
Yeah.
And the period when the lime kiln is working, it's not going to be constantly working. It's only going to be working for that period when they're doing this major work of either initial building or restoration. And it's not going to be used. I don't think it will be used a great deal after that. Right. So it's not Constantinian, it's Theodosian.
I think if everybody saw that come up at the bottom again from
Thank you. Right.
Now, if anybody, that's actually the end of the questions we've got so far. If anybody else has got anything else they want to ask, please be quick. Usually when I say that, we get a barrage, so steel yourself. Not tonight, I don't think. I think you covered everything so well, people don't know what to ask.
Yes, and they didn't pick up all the howlers.
Couldn't possibly comment. I didn't. So no, that appears to be it.
Right. Okay.
So it just remains for me to thank everybody who's attended tonight's talk. A special thanks as well to our backroom team, who most people never see, although everybody bar Jim actually asked a question tonight. So thanks to you guys, and of course, most importantly, thanks to Jim it was a different Jim I was meaning before. We have a backroom guy, Jim Grady.
Yeah.
And thanks to Jim for the talk, which was absolutely fantastic and very informative. And hopefully it's given everybody a lot more information about the site than they already knew. There was a question which didn't get passed on to me, which I've just spotted, asking whether High Rochester is accessible.
Very much so. Northumberland National Park have done a very good job, actually. I mean, it's the centre of the fort is actually the equivalent of village green, so it's accessible in that sense. And the Northumberland National Park have arranged there's access routes both from the main road, and there's a small visitor centre now, and then there's a walking route which comes up from there and then comes up to the fort, and there are stiles. No, they've done an excellent job.
Mm-hmm.
So it's perfectly, whereas unfortunately Risingham is not at all accessible.
No. I didn't notice the visitor centre last time. We were only there a few months ago. I didn't spot that.
It's down. Yeah, they haven't. It's next to the cafe. It's where the car park and the cafe is. It's next to that, and then they put this visitor centre.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Oh, hang on.
Oh no,
Another one.
no. Sorry, I can read it, and you don't have to read it. And my answer is no, I can't. I'm not being unkind. It's simply that I don't. I mean, there may well have been some form of settlement at Hexham. I'd be most surprised if there wasn't a sort of Roman Iron Age or pre-Roman settlement on the site of Hexham, but we've got no trace of it. But and it's now been suggested to me that there is a Roman road which comes down towards Hexham, but I'm still not convinced of that, and I've never actually seen it.
No.
But at the same time, the Roman material which is in Hexham, which is in Hexham Abbey, is clearly all derived from Corbridge, but not from Hexham itself.
Yeah, I think
that was the whole point. That was why I mentioned it.
Yeah, I think people underestimate, actually, sometimes. I've seen a lot of talk about Hexham. People underestimate how far Roman masonry can actually move. For example, there's stone in Ripon Cathedral, which is from Aldborough, which is 10 miles away. It would have been brought up the river, easy enough.
Yes.
Similarly, from Aldborough, several of the local churches within a 10-mile radius have stone from there within them. They were just used as quarries, easy and accessible.
Yeah.
All right. Finally, I think that probably is it.
Right.
So I'm going to bid everybody a good night. We normally have a quick chat with the speaker if you've got another 5 minutes.
Right.
Close the meeting down, then open it up again if you rejoin, Jim. So.
Oh, right. So
one thing
I rejoin. So I leave and rejoin. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Right.
We'll just have a very quick chat.
Good night, everybody else. Thanks for joining us.
Good night, everybody.